Hey, we're going to take a look real quick at running AWS Invoke local in WSL. I've got a Go project here, so Serverless is going to run that inside of Docker. That's how they operate Go lambdas or Go functions run inside of a Docker container. You can also optionally run any other language if you're running Node or Python or Java lambdas. You can optionally invoke those inside of Docker as well, but Go by default. And the only way to run that is to run it through Docker. I'm on a Windows machine, so I'm running WSL. I ran into a little bit of an issue, and if you come across this or similar issue when trying to run Serverless Invoke local, hopefully this can be a little bit of help. So real quick, we're going to run the Serverless Invoke local command, and I have this orders function here. We're going to run this. We're going to show how this is going to break, and we'll take a look at the error that is returned when I run this. But under normal operating circumstances, this is what you would run to start up or to invoke the Lambda locally on your machine. And if you're running in a language like Node or Python, Java, the serverless is just going to take care of booting and running and executing that function. In this case, it's also going to, behind the scenes, because I'm in a Go project, pass the Docker flag. If you were, again, running a Node or Python or whatever function, then you could pass this flag, and that would force it to launch with Docker. In this case, it's optional. It's going to do that on its own. We'll take a look at what happens. All right, and we have completed. We can see here that the error is no such file or directory. So this was the error that I was getting originally. Took me a little bit to dawn on me, but the very first thing that I thought the issue was I'm running in WSL right now. That's what is giving me the Linux looking CLI here, but I'm actually on a Windows machine. And I'm running Docker inside of Docker Toolbox, which is actually running on a virtual machine. So what is actually going on here, one of the first things that I realized is when I run this command, it's probably, just assuming that it's probably trying to mount the current directory that I'm in, which is the /mount C, which is actually where my local file system, where the files are stored, are mounted in terms of how WSL sees it. Unfortunately, when you look over here, and we bring up a terminal here of inside my virtual machine that's running boot to Docker, which is where the Docker host is actually running, and I look at my directory here, it's actually, so this path here, which would be mount C users, is actually found over here at /c users go see, yeah, go source. All right, and so this actually gets me to the correct place where I want to be with all my files, but the path is /c. So I did some digging, and I found that there's actually another parameter that we passed in here. So we saw the Docker flag. I don't think this is necessary since we already know that for this Go project it's going to be booting to Docker. But if you are running a Node or a Python or something else, you want to force it into Docker and you're running into this issue, you're going to have that Docker flag. There's another flag here that you can pass in, which is docker-arg. And this one, I'll just skip the reasoning, but it does require the equal sign. There's a bug currently in this version as of October 14th, 2019, that requires, if you were just to leave the space there and pass in some args here, it's going to give you an error for a split string, so on and so forth. Just in case you do happen to run into that, in the not too distant future. Remember the equal sign here, it will solve that problem. And this basically allows you to pass in arguments directly to the Docker container that's going to get started when serverless executes the Docker run command. So assumingly, and all the examples are showing how you can override ports and whatnot, I assumed naturally that I could override the volume that would actually get mounted to where to the correct location inside the container. Inside the container, we can see up here that we're looking at var task as the mount point, the working directory. The bin orders is how I have configured my serverless YAML to actually look for the executable or my function. It's going to be looking under the bin directory and orders. So it essentially mounts whatever you've set in your serverless config or serverless YAML as the path into the working directory inside the container, which is at var task. So my original thought was if I pass in here attack v and use, instead of the default path that that serverless would be using that I'm in here, actually mount the correct path and override that. So in this case, it would be users go source, the project name, and then we'll put that at our var task. Run that again. All right, and now running that command comes back with a duplicate mount point. So this is something that I wasn't anticipating. It looks like that when you pass in the Docker args, it doesn't overwrite any previous. It actually just merges the values with what it's doing already. So in this case, we're not able to successfully overwrite the mount path as I had hoped that we would be able to do. So what ended up working in this case was actually a little bit interesting. So I knew that in this case, Serverless Invoke local was using the default path and that I wouldn't be able to override the path as we just saw here. So as the last result or last option, it's actually fooling the system and actually creating this path on our Docker host. So like I mentioned earlier, WSL is looking in the directory that it thinks is the correct directory based on its path to where the files live inside of or on the Docker host inside the virtual machine. These are actually at a different path. But what we're going to end up doing is creating a symbolic link to trick, quote unquote, the host, the Docker host, into pointing to the correct location. So that's going to look something like this. So we're going to cd to where it's going to look on this host, which is the same path that WSL is using, which is going to be mount c users tab complete that, go source. And what we're going to do is we're not going to actually go all the way down. This will continue with our source and our project directory. What I found is for this to work with the symbolic link, you actually have to make it above the directory. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to the directory above where our project exists. And inside this directory, as you can see, there's nothing here yet. We're going to create a symbolic link that fills the path, but we're going to point it over to, so if we do, this is mount, and then we can cd the actual path that the file system, or that the files exist in our Docker host where they're mounted. We actually want to link this path to complete it, so the source to this directory here, and that's going to look something like this. And what we're going to do is create a symbolic link here to the directory that those files exist. See that up above. Of course, I need permissions to do that. So now, if I look, we now have a path source here, and I can continue through and now I have the full path in my or on my Docker host that when I execute serverless invoke local, that it's going to be looking for. And if we look at the files, we're actually getting the files. This is kind of a workaround. So we've created this path, we've made it exist on our Docker host, even though the files are located somewhere different on that host due to the mount point of the virtual machine. It's kind of tricky to think about, but doing this actually solves our problem. So if we jump back over here and we look at, we're in our project and we're going to do the same thing. We're going to do serverless invoke. Now we don't need to pass any arguments because now we're actually going to be using the same mount path that we have here in WSL. And this succeeds. We're getting a response, but that's what we expect because we're not actually passing any payload into this function, but we can see that the function actually executed and we're getting back a response object from that function. That about sums it up today. Just a quick look at executing serverless invoke local for Go programs or running anything inside a Docker container when you're on Windows and using a virtual machine. So hopefully that helps you out.